Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Creation Myths. Thank you for joining me for part two of Wrong Answers Only, our series where we are going through the new answers books from AIG, one chapter at a time. It sounds like everything's good, but if there are any audio issues or anything, just let me know in the chat and I'll deal with it as necessary. So tonight we are going to take a look at chapter 2 from the new Answers book 1 from Answers in Genesis. This chapter is shorter than the first one. There's less to talk about in here. Some of it is also a little bit theological. So there's less for me to comment on. I'm sure other people could find other things to correct in here, but much of this chapter is outside of my expertise. So there's a little bit of history in here that I'm going to comment on, and there's a little bit of geology, actually, that I'm going to comment on, and that's where we're going to leave it. So I expect this to be shorter than part one in this series. And then just a programming note going forward, the next chapter is similarly quite a bit of theology. It's not a whole lot of like biological sciences. So what I might do is combine that with the chapter. I have two chapters 3 and 4 together. I'm going to see how everything kind of comes together. Maybe I'll do some shorter installments. Maybe I'll do a couple chapters together in one video to get to the maybe 20 minutes instead of doing like a 5-minute video. I haven't decided yet, but just that'll be next week when we get to the next episode. But enough delaying here. Let's get right to it. Chapter 2 in this book is titled "Why Shouldn't Christians Accept Millions of Years?" And we just have a few things to talk about here. And if you were reading the notes there while I was talking, you maybe saw a little spoiler of what we have coming up. There are some really fun things in this chapter that I'm looking forward to getting to. So the first thing I want to comment on is right here on the first page of the chapter. About 200 years ago, some scientists developed new theories of Earth's history, which propose that the Earth and universe are millions of years old. That's not exactly right. It's millions, 17 to 1800s is when people started thinking with that many digits in the number. But in terms of, if we're talking strictly about getting out of the young Earth mindset, that was a little bit earlier than that. People started, I want to say it was probably in the 1600s. You had people kind of proposing ages that had 5 or maybe even 6 digits in them. So I think this is generally an okay statement, interpreted narrowly. But I think the broader implication of like we were young Earth until like 1800 or so, I think that's not quite right. And I just wanted to comment on that. So we're going to skip ahead just a little bit here because, like I said, some of this stuff gets a little bit like into the theology of it, and like, was the Bible written to be taken literally, or was it written as myth and whatnot, right? And like, I don't care. That is not interesting to me. I'm not an expert in it, so I don't care. They talk about like the translations of the words they use to represent day. Other people have commented on this. I don't need to comment on it. I have nothing to contribute on it. So we're going to keep moving until we get to this statement, which I love. Noah's flood would produce exactly the kind of complex geological record we see worldwide today. Thousands of feet of sediment clearly deposited by water and later hardened into rock and containing billions of fossils. That's not true. Like, that's not, like, there's nothing about what the flood would predict that is in line with what we actually see in the geological record. And I actually talked to some of my geologist friends for this. So if any of you are listening, hi, thank you. I appreciate your helping me out earlier today as I was looking at this. There's so many features of the world, of the geological column, that just fly in the face of a massive global flood laying down the vast majority of those layers. So, for example, speaking biologically first, let's talk about fossils. We have fossils in layered, right, going from earliest, the deepest, to most recent, the shallowest, and we see a pattern of increasing complexity as you go from deeper, which is to say older, to shallower, which is to say more recent. And creationists, I love the justification we get for this. The creationists will say things like, well, the more complex animals were smarter, so like they climbed up to the higher ground. So that's why they were buried in the higher layers. But those stupid primitive things, they're down lower because they didn't think to like run away from the floodwaters. One, as though like things like insects or something or worms don't like try to escape things that are going to kill them if they don't move. But two, this is silly because like not every animal would have access to high ground. Even like really smart animals, like, I don't know, whales or primates, they don't necessarily live near mountains. So you're not going to be able to just get up into what becomes the highest levels in the geological column. It's just silly. Maybe you can get to like the highest tree and the highest hill near you, but in an absolute sense, that's not going to be very high in the geological column for lots of things. And that's only for animals. Let's forget animals. What about plants? Right? Yeah, someone in the chat here. Exactly. What about plants? Right? The geological column is full of that same kind of pattern of emergent complexity for plants. The thing with plants is that they don't move once they take root, right? The seeds move around, but the plants themselves don't move. So like, okay, you have mosses at the bottom and then like ferns coming up a little bit later, and then like your gymnosperms and then your angiosperms most recently. All the flowering plants didn't just like uproot themselves and climb all the nearest hills and mountains to escape the floodwaters because they're plants. They can't do that. So like, this doesn't make any sense. Like this claim just biologically doesn't make any sense. It's just like flies in the face of reality. But there's also the geological problems with it, and there are plenty of those. We also, for example, deep in the geological column, you find layers that are clearly deposited by lakes and rivers, by the normal calm processes of sedimentation that we observe today. But those normal calm processes of sedimentation aren't going to be happening during a catastrophic global flood, right? It's going to be all a big, giant, highly energetic mess. So you're not going to see that same type of deposition occurring. So that violates the flood story there. And then, of course, we also see erosion in the geological column. So you see things like hills and valleys and canyons that are buried deep within the geological column. Well, you can't carve out a canyon like under a flood, right? That's not how that works. You can't carve out a canyon and fill it in subsequently with new deposition and then layer it on top of each other. So then later on, it looks like, oh, there was a canyon carved out and then it was subsequently filled in, and that happened during a flood. No, you can't do that, right? So clearly the physical record of the Earth does not, what's the phrase here, produce exactly the kind of complex geological record. No, the complex geological record is completely different from what we would expect in the case of a global flood. And again, shout out to my geology friends for helping me through some of those examples earlier today. I appreciate you. Okay, so let's keep going here. I don't care what Jesus thought of any of this. It doesn't matter to me. That doesn't matter. Okay, here we go. The idea of millions of years did not come from scientific facts. I mean, yes, it did. It came from people making observations. This isn't that hard. This idea of long ages was developed by deistic and atheistic geologists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These men used anti-biblical philosophical and religious assumptions to interpret the geological observations in a way that plainly contradicted the biblical account of creation, the flood, and the age of the earth. Now, that's wrong, right? We could actually look at like what these people were saying at the time. And so, for example, James Hutton like directly observed like erosion and weathering like over years, right? He just like looked at these processes and said like, okay, it sure looks like it takes a long time to like carve out a canyon or something, right? And here we go. Here's another one for you. Great example, Charles Lyell, devout Christian his whole life. And then another example of this is actually Charles Darwin, not a geologist, but I think would fall in the same category of people with motivated reasoning here, according to AIG. Charles Darwin very famously like had conflicts about his faith as he was making his observations. And very famously, one of his most important observations for his own way of thinking wasn't biological, it was geological. He observed an earthquake in South America, and being able to directly measure the amount of change that that earthquake caused, this big catastrophic event. He was actually able to measure the relative position of different formations before and after the earthquake. And he could look at that change, which is a big, sudden, really catastrophic change, and see that it was tiny compared to mountains. So you needed to have long periods of time, even with big catastrophic events, to generate the physical world as we see it, right? So this paragraph, this is just wrong. It was the conclusion of an ancient Earth was very clearly based on observations, not assumed for philosophical reasons and then backfilled, as AIG is claiming. And then we can go down here. Radiometric dating methods do not prove millions of years. Now, I don't like to use the word prove in science, but I am going to make an exception for that here. Radiometric dating techniques 100% prove that the world is billions of years old, period, full stop, the end. Like, you know, that's the end of that discussion. We have proved that the world is that old. We're going to talk in a little more detail about this in a few minutes, so I'm not going to belabor the point here. So we're going to move on to the next thing, but we will be spending the rest of this talking about radiometric dating, basically. And this is the part where I'm going to try not to make myself look like a fool. So wish me luck, everybody. All right. Now we have the part where creationists are refuting radiometric dating. We have, for many years, creation scientists have cited numerous examples in the published scientific literature of these dating methods clearly giving erroneous dates, e.g., a date of millions of years for lava flows that occurred in the past few hundred years or even decades. In recent years, we'll stop there and then we'll get to the rate project in a second. I actually broke that in two for a reason. So, first of all, here, what creationists like to do is, for example, is they'll say, well, you could use, uranium lead dating or something. I don't know the specific methods they've used for this, but they'll say, uranium lead dating, or some kind of isochron dating that gives you a long, a really long time window. And they'll say, well, you could do this dating on Mount St. Helens eruption stuff. And we know that only happened in, whatever year, 1980 or whatever it was. And fact check me on that one. If you're anyone watching this as I'm doing it and in the future, fact check me on Mount St. Helens. I forget the year. I think it's 1980, give or take, 80 something. And they'll say, look, we know when it happened. It was like 40 years ago, but you do the technique and you get a date of like, a million years ago or whatever. Therefore, that technique is invalid. You get an old date no matter what you do. That's dumb because you're using the wrong technique for the job. It's below the detection threshold, and those techniques like uranium lead or argon, for example, these techniques give you things in the time horizons of millions to billions of years. So if you're looking at the differences in isotope concentrations just within decades, what you end up dealing with is you just don't have enough data. Your sample size is so tiny, it's essentially just outliers, and you don't get reliable data because decay is probabilistic. So if you're not looking at a long enough window for the technique you're using, you're going to get an invalid date. When you use the correct techniques, like you could use techniques with a shorter window, and I forget the specific technique they used, but you could use techniques with shorter windows to date specific events very precisely in the relatively recent past, in the hundreds or thousands of years ago. So it's a matter of using the right tool for the job. It was 1980. Thank you for fact checking me on that. So moving on to the next line here. In recent years, creationists in the RATE project have done experimental, theoretical, and field research to uncover more such evidence. And they go through some of it. Diamonds and coal, which evolutionarily are millions of years old, have carbon-14. The specific study with carbon-14 and diamonds that they like to point to was a calibration study where they were looking at the background reading in the instrumentation and basically used a diamond because it doesn't have carbon-14 in it. And they were using that as like a blank sample, essentially, and then looking at what the machine turned as the background kind of baseline level so that they could calibrate their readings. And that study is then misused by creationists. Oh, look, they found carbon-14 in diamond. Like that's just silly. I'll have more to say on the RAPE project in just a few minutes because one of their conclusions is something most creationists don't like to talk about. And then we have this piece right here, which is actually the very last thing that I'm going to talk about in this chapter, because as you can see, we're at the conclusion right here. That's the end. So here we have the very last line here. Decay rates were orders of magnitude faster in the past, which shrinks the millions of years to thousands of years, confirming the Bible. Now, that is wrong for a number of reasons. So first, I want to just talk about my favorite thing from the RAPE project, which is in their conclusion. They acknowledge something that I didn't mention before in the context of the flood because I was saving it for this moment right now. They acknowledge that if you have this accelerated nuclear decay, if you have different rates in the past that were higher, and that explains how you get the appearance of old age through radiometric dating. Even though it's actually young, what you do is you compress billions of years of decay into just a few thousands of years. The problem with that is that decay generates heat. So this is one of the sources of heat that leads to the so-called heat problem for the global flood and the young Earth. And creationists don't have a solution to this. Many have tried, but there is, right now, no workable solution to the heat problem. The RAPE project attempted to deal with this, and their conclusion when it comes to the excess heat generated by their accelerated nuclear decay model was that it would require exotic solutions to mitigate the heat so it didn't vaporize the surface of the Earth. And by exotic solutions, we mean miracles, which, fine, if you want to invoke miracles, go for it, but now you don't have a competing scientific theory, right? Now we're no longer hypothesis testing here if we're just going to invoke miracles anytime we run up against a problem that we can't solve. But we do have, oh, hang on a second here. I just want to, here we go. I just want to pull up another comment from Mr. Wilford, one of the geology friends who helped me out with this stuff earlier today. There's also the heat from plate tectonics. Baumgartner, a young Earth creationist who deals with this, he thinks miracles are needed to deal with that heat as well. So there's no solution to the heat problem, which invalidates the whole enterprise right off the top there. Thank you for that contribution, Mr. Wilford. I appreciate it. But there's another problem here with this idea that decay rates were faster in the past. And it's the fact that we've actually observed these things. We have direct testable predictions, and we can actually basically go back in time and check to see if decay rates were the same in the past or if they differed. And the answer is they're the same. And we know this because of one of my favorite things that I have ever learned about in my life, which is the Oklo natural nuclear reactors. So let me tell you for a few minutes about the Oklo nuclear reactors, and that's how we're going to wrap this up. What happened was in the 1970s, a French company was mining for uranium in modern-day Gabon in kind of Central Africa. And in this uranium formation that they were mining, the desired isotope is 235 because that's fissionable. And what they found was that there was too little U-235 in some of these formations. There was just too little. So they were like, okay, this is a problem. Like, we have to account for fissionable material. What's going on here, right? Clearly, the amount of material is lower than it should be. And they realized that the difference, the discrepancy between what they thought was going to be there and what they actually found in these formations, that discrepancy could be explained by fission happening at some point in the past, right? So they said, okay, these formations are about 2 billion years old. Fission could have happened back then, right? You would have had a high enough concentration of the fissionable isotopes to happen back then. So if that happened 2 billion years ago, right? And then you say, okay, it got it down to the level and then it subsequently decayed to get to the level where it's at now. You could say, okay, how long would it take to get, like, you could do the math on this. The math is not something I can do, but it's something that people can do that are experts in this. And what they did is they said, okay, given the discrepancy and what we see now, how far back in the past do you have to go for the fission to have occurred to generate that discrepancy? There's about 2 billion years. It matches up with the age of those formations as determined through other mechanisms of radiometric dating, right? So the important thing to note here is that uranium decay and uranium fission are separate processes that have separate products called daughter isotopes, right? So the decay chain is one set of isotopes, and the fission products are different from that. And that's really important because that means we can say, okay, it's not just going to be less of the uranium, more of the products, because it's two sets of products. So it's less of the uranium, and we should see specifically the fission products in the specific amount that would have been generated if fission occurred in the quantity and at the time we think it did about 2 billion years ago. So they went looking for other isotopes, things like neodymium 143. The excess in that isotope exactly matched what you would predict based on the missing U-235. Spot on. There are also several isotopes of ruthenium. Same thing. They're in the fission pathway from uranium, but you had different levels in the decay pathway. So they were able to look at the discrepancy in ruthenium isotopes and see, yes, that is exactly what we would predict based on X amount of fission 2 billion years ago. Boom, there it is. This is really important because it basically cross-checks a bunch of different physical processes, because we were able to make these very accurate predictions based on something happening 2 billion years ago. In order for these predictions to be correct, the rate of decay and the way fission works had to be the same all throughout this time, these 2 billion years. If fission worked differently in the past, if the decay rate had been different in the past, then these numbers would not come out the way we expected them to come out. And they match the predictions exactly. And there's one more really interesting note about this. There's one more isotope here that was enriched. It's really interesting. It's samarium 150, which is not a fission product and it's not a decay product. It actually originates from samarium 149 through a process called neutron capture. Well, where do neutrons get released from? Fission releases neutrons. So we can predict how much excess samarium 150 we should see based on the amount of fission that occurred. And when you know it, we see exactly the amount that we expected. And there's one more really interesting note to that part of the story, is that neutron capture is in part governed by something called the fine structure constant. It's one of these constants that governs how subatomic particles interact and deal with each other. I don't know the physics of it. I'm not a physicist, but this, as I understand it, the fine structure content has to do with like how they interact with each other. In order for the amount of samarium that we observe, the specific isotope, to match the predictions, that fine structure constant, which has to do with like the structure and stability of atomic nuclei, that thing has to be constant going back 2 billion years. So if we have fission working the exact same way, decay working the exact same way, the fine structure constant being constant actually for about 2 billion years, we can say 100% we have proved it. The decay rates have not changed. There's nothing about radiometric dating in the present or radiometric decay in the present that is different from in the past. And therefore we can say with 100% certainty, going back to a couple pages to this claim right here, we can say radiometric dating methods do not prove millions of years. 100%, that statement is true. Radiometric dating methods prove billions of years. And that's the big takeaway from this chapter, because there's no biology for me to comment on. So that is where we are going to leave it for tonight. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate you all being here. Please hit that like button and share this if you haven't done so already. We'll be back next week with, at the very least, Chapter 3, but there's not much to comment on in Chapter 3, so I may smush it together with Chapter 4 and maybe even Chapter 5. We'll see next week, but we'll do Episode 3 next week. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.